Good afternoon. It's Saturday, and we are talking about things that affect your money. And if you listened to us before, then you know that when we look at investments, we look at a couple different criteria that we're looking for. We're looking for changes in demographics, changes in lifestyle, and changes in technology. And today, we're going to dive into changes in demographics. I don't know if you heard, but this week, China announced for the first time in 60 years that they had a decline in their population. Why is that significant? The population fell in 2022 to 1.411 billion, down some 850,000 from the previous year. That's what China's National Bureau of Statistics announced. The analysis said the decline was the first since 1961 during the Great Famine that triggered by Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward. China is interesting in the sense that it has the largest population in the world, and it also had a one-child policy that they pulled back. I think it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. They decided, okay, we're not having enough young people, so we need to have more babies, and it hasn't really worked. And the other problem is that, like the rest of the Western world, is China has a huge aging population. And so what does this mean for investments? What does it mean for global trends as far as how we look at where the growth is going to be? Right now, the growth is in African countries are growing faster than Western countries are. They're still having more children, still down from previous years, but they're still up compared to the Western world. So we want to dive into the population trends and see, kind of try to put a spin on what effects that's going to have going forward long term.
It's really important to understand, because if you look at U.S. companies, half the revenues of the Standard & Poor's companies come from overseas. And it's not just the jobs and the factories that we're talking about. If you think about somebody, we're in Seattle, we're Starbucks country. If you think about Starbucks in China or Starbucks in Europe or Asia, those jobs are not manufacturing jobs. Those are not jobs we will bring back to the U.S. Those are jobs that are created in those countries and depend upon the income of the people in those countries to generate incomes for Starbucks. It's a domestic company, but their revenues are derived overseas, and they're one of many of the S&P 500 companies. So when we look at demographics, when we look at lifestyles overseas, it has an impact on U.S. companies. And so it's important. So when you talk about China and what's happened in China, that has an impact. When you talk about Senegal, when you talk about South Africa, when we talk about the Ukraine or Kazakhstan, all those countries have an impact on what's happening in the U.S. And we need to be aware of that for our investments.
And when you throw on top of that, Mike, the rapid, technological changes that are moving, we've talked about we look at this new one that's everyone's jumping on now, GPT chat, if you haven't seen that. It's kind of amazing what it will do when you ask it a question and what it will build. And a friend of mine who's an attorney said he wanted it to build him some sort of a legal document. He said he put it in there and just built the whole thing for him. He says, well, I was impressed. I don't think I could build it that well myself, But as that advances with robotics and everything and workers become replaced, what happens with an aging population and we're not having enough children, and yet we have a huge aging population. So,
in China, in the next 10 years, they'll reach the point where they have one worker for every retiree. And you think about the impact of that. That's happening shortly thereafter in Japan. It's going to happen in the United States by the end of this century. Those are real issues that face changes in lifestyles.
Well, one of the other things, Mike, is it took us till 1960 to get to 3 billion people. And from 1960 to now, we went from 3 billion to 8 billion people. And by 2021, by the end of the century, we think we'll be at 11 billion people. And what the demographers believe is that we're going to tap out at about 11 billion, and then we're going to start to decline.
Maybe.
Yeah, I'm not saying they know for sure. But just to give you an example of what this is, I came across this, and I wasn't really looking for it, but there was this education consulting firm, and they consult colleges on, how to be more efficient, profitable, and those type of things. And they're concerned. They're saying in 2025 that they're going to see the decline of students. And what's that going to mean if they have such lower enrollments? They're saying that even elite universities are starting to think, we need to I don't know if they lower their threshold, but take in more kids because we're not going to see enough revenues from kids going to school because there's not enough young people coming up because women are we're not having as many kids as we used to have.
And if you look at what's happening, the fastest growing segment in our population is the people over 100. I'm old enough to remember a program called Queen for a Day.
You're going to have to explain that one to me.
So it was an ArtLink letter program, and on that program, they would post and mention the name of someone who turned 100 years old. There were so few in the 1950s or 1960s, and I don't remember what.
Right.
But there were so few people that turned 100 at that time.
Yeah.
And now everybody knows at least one person or two or three or four or five that are 100 years old.
I don't know any 100-year-old people. I know the 90s, but not 100.
You just have to wait another 10 years.
No, but this article goes on to say because of COVID, it was already a tough year. And this is on their website. I was reading this. EAB Education Consulting, it's called. Colleges and universities have been bracing for a much-feared demographic cliff. The steep drop-off in potential first-time freshmen projected to arrive in not far away, 2025, 26. They're looking at this, see a steep drop-off and decline in, I don't know how accurate they are, but it's right around the corner.
Yeah, that's a change in the demographics. That's a change in what goes on.
Yeah, I mean, it's just saying, it goes on to say that the institutions ended up admitting more students from applicant pools and waiting lists just to meet their tuition revenue goals. Interesting.
One thing that happened that's a change in the demographics is there used to be a lot of students coming from foreign countries that would be educated in the U.S., and then they would stay in the U.S. One of the changes that's happening is we're seeing students educated in the U.S. go back to their own countries.
Why is that? Did they point to a reason why that is?
A lot of the reason is because the internet, so they can access a lot of materials directly.
Yeah.
Secondly, there's the opportunities that are being created in those countries.
That's true. Yeah.
When you think about the medical, for example, I mean, there was a time 30 years ago when the best medical attention was here in the U.S. Many countries now have medical systems that are equivalent to the U.S.
And a lot less expensive.
Yeah,
I had a friend that we were talking about. I forget what he was having done, but he says, I go down to Mexico. He says, I can go to the best hospital, walk right in and have it done for a third or a quarter of the cost.
We have a couple clients who live part-time in Ecuador.
Yeah.
They rave about the medical service they get there. And as you say, it's a lot cheaper. And some of it is one of the clients had a frozen shoulder, went to Ecuador, had medical work done here in the U.S., could not get it undone. They have a place in Ecuador, went to the medical people there, and the person solved it almost right away. The interesting thing is that the person that he went to see was from Bow, Washington. There's a very large growing number of Americans who are moving to foreign countries, to Panama, to Ecuador, to Portugal, and Italy. You have large expat groups in many of those countries, and they're demanding medical attention. They're getting medical attention.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I bring it back to China, as we talked about, the new data came along and announced that China's, worst annual economic performance in nearly half a century. I mean, so when they think about it with low childbirth and a lot of older people, a third of their population over 65, that's not a recipe for a burgeoning economy.
No, and it's an economy that they want to be self-contained.
Yeah.
They want to lead the world in a number of technical areas. And I think it's worth talking about as we come back to after this commercial break, talking about what's happening because the United States is responding to that. And so are many other countries. Yep. And I'm not sure that what's happening is favorable in terms of lifestyles, investments. I think there's some real issues with this administration and the impact it's having on the world. We're doing away with free trade to a subsidy protectionist attitude, justified by competing against China and winning against China. But I'm not sure it's going to be that favorable. I have real questions about this administration and doing away with free trade.
Yeah, I don't see how doing away with free trade is. We know the fastest way to grow an economy is through trade.
We do. We're doing away with that. So we ended the last segment talking and saying maybe we need to talk about free trade. There's a speech that American National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan gave, in which he said maintaining a technological lead over China and other rivals was no longer enough. Instead, he said America had to pursue as large a lead as possible in chipmaking, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and clean energy. And in saying that, he pointed out that we not only needed to welcome clever people and foster innovation, but to actually push technological advances to beat countries like China and Russia. And he said there were two ways to ensure American supremacy. One was using subsidies and other forms of industrial policy to shift chains away from geopolitical rivals. And secondly, stricter investment screening and export controls to keep advanced technology out of unfriendly hands. What he's really talking about is restricting free trade. You know, beginning in the 1960s and beyond, America was the big leader in leading free trade in the world. We built the globalization system, which was significant in lifting millions of people out of poverty, which made things cheaper for us in the U.S., which grew foreign economies significantly, which in turn, since many of the revenues of the S&P companies come from overseas, improved the revenues and the earnings of U.S. companies. Now we're talking, and this administration has pumped almost $500 billion into technologies and subsidizing computer chips, green energy, and the environment. We're subsidizing a lot of industries. We want to move things back to the U.S. It all sounds good. It all sounds wonderful. It all sounds great for the United. But the question is, will it be in the long term? I have questions about it. I have real questions that it's going to produce positive results. Not only is the U.S. doing it, but according to the United Nations, more than 100 countries that account for 90% of the world's GDP are now instituting strategies to do subsidies to their own industries. G7 countries were subsidizing companies to the point of 0.6% of their GDP. In 2016, it's now over 2%, and it's growing. You know, when you think about the chip, there were some advantages to moving those chips to the U.S., an advantage so much to the point that we put $52 billion into chip makers. It sounds really like a lot, but in reality, it's only part of the $371 billion that's supposed to pour into the semiconductor industry over the next few years. And that $370 billion is not just the U.S. That's countries like China, the EU, India, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Everybody is pushing to move semiconductors. I mean, right now, it seemed like a really smart move because our chips were made in Taiwan and South Korea. But what we found is by the U.S. putting together a deal to do $52 billion, other countries said, oh, we have to do our own deal. There's new subsidies for EV batteries. China makes 70% of the EV batteries, but now you have dozens of countries that are subsidizing batteries.
But China controls a lot of has a good sum of the natural resource batteries. That's one of the issues.
So does Indonesia. Indonesia has just banned the export of nickel.
Did they? Okay.
So the batteries would be made in Indonesia.
And I think China has a huge lithium mine. So
it's a very interesting phase that we're entering. Mm-hmm. And the question is, will it be a benefit to the U.S. citizens?
Remains to be seen.
Remains to be seen.
Yeah.
But what it does is it's a change. It's a change in lifestyles. It's a change in demographics.
Right. And since we've been experiencing inflation, how is this going to affect if we want this made in America bringing things back? We know that we have a lot more unions here and things, minimum wage and things like that. What's it going to do to drive up keeping inflation when we know we're short 4 million jobs right now?
And
those are highly technical jobs, Mike. Those aren't low-skilled labor work.
Very true.
So it's an interesting dichotomy there we're going to be facing 5 to 10 years.
So we face some real challenges. And when you think about it, that's what investment is all about. Richard Foster of Yale did this study that we talk about very often on the program because companies that were in the Standard & Poor's in 1920 had an average life of 70 years. Today, it's down to less than 15 years. And some of the changes that are going on are going to affect a lot of companies. There are going to be companies that benefit from it and companies that are hurt by it. It's figuring out how all this plays out in each one of those companies and where the investment should be.
That's the term economist Joseph Schumpeter coined, right? Creative destruction.
It is.
But, we talk about demographics, Mike, and we talk about technology, and we've talked about automation. And these new factories, like the new factories we talked about, are going to be so highly automated. How many people are they going to actually employ?
That's also. When you have a robot, they never show up late for work.
No.
They never call in sick.
Have you ever seen seen that movie Wall-E, the Disney movie?
No, I haven't.
Oh, you got to go see it. It's this little robot that gets lost and then finds his way, and he finds his way into some sort of future spaceship. And the people on the spaceship they sit on a conveyor belt, and they're just all extremely overweight with like a 7-Eleven Big Gulp at Eaton, and they don't have to move at all because everything's automated for them. I hope that's not the future, but who the heck knows?
Who knows? I mean, robots are here to stay. And one of the major investment themes going forward is going to be robotics. And it's not just R2-D2 or C-3PO. I mean, those robots are coming as well. In Japan, they have a little cuddly robot because Japan is nearing the point where they're going to be short 4 million workers, healthcare workers. And they began a number of years ago to develop robots. And they have robots that will toilet people that are living in nursing homes, the elderly, that will brush their teeth, that will take care of all those things, but also cuddly little robots that they can talk to.
Yeah, it's like we talked about China. And here's the stat. China's elderly make up 1/5 if it's 1.4 billion.
Yeah.
That's roughly 280 million. That's about the size of the United States. So think of that, right? We're about 330 million, but that's close to about the size of the United States of just elderly people. That's staggering.
It is.
When you put it in that context, that's,
And the projection is that for the world, by 2050, that's not that far away, by the way.
No.
By 2050, the number of grandparents will outnumber the people that are under 15.
That's crazy.
I mean, 1 out of every 5 people on the planet will be a grandparent or grandparent age anyway. And think about in terms of grandparents. In China, every child has 4 grandparents and 2 parents because of the one-child policy.
Mm-hmm.
That means that there's 4 people who are retired for every child practically.
Yeah.
Actually, it's 1 to 1. But, when China instituted that policy of 1 child, the average life expectancy was 64. Now it's approaching 80.
Yeah.
It's made a huge difference. But as these things change, they create opportunities for investment. They create opportunities for disinvestment in certain companies. Things are changing. And the idea of this program is to put people ahead of the curve instead of behind the curve, to raise the issues that face us in the future, not talking about the current issues. But if you're going to make real money in the stock market, you're going to have to do it by looking ahead, not behind.
Well, I mean, this is one author I was reading from the CFA Institute. She's an economist author, Dembisi Moyo. I think she's in Britain. But she says over the next 20 years, 47% of all jobs in the United States will be eroded or disrupted by technology.
We see it now. Just look around. We're coming to a commercial break. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this commercial break, giving you more insight into the changes in technology, lifestyles, and demographics that are going on. It's important to understand.
About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's your AFC team, Mike and Al.
So, Mike, we were saying about technology, right? 47% of the jobs being disrupted by technology. It's kind of equivalent to, think about the 1900s. Most of the U.S. workforce was involved in agriculture. Today, less than 2% of the U.S. workforce is. It's largely a function of technological advances.
Here I sit, shaking my head, yes.
Yeah, I know.
People could see on the...
And, this economist Moyo anticipates similar transformations in the years ahead. Most of the heavy automation is taking place where much of the world's population work. In the unskilled and low-skilled positions of manufacturing. She says this leads to fewer jobs, fewer worked hours, to less human productivity, and is accompanied by a decline in real wages, thus further impeding economic growth. So it's quite a challenge that we love technology and innovation, but it's going to lead to impeding less economic growth and could be declines in GDP. How do we balance that?
It's interesting because you mentioned the past. And I can remember that in 1850, there were 13...
You remember 1850?
Well, I'm pretty old. No, I remember data from 1850.
Oh, okay, that sounds better.
That's
all
a little better.
That's a little bit better.
But in 1850, there were 23 million people living in the U.S.
Yeah.
11 million were either farm workers, owned farms, or related to farm work. There was the forecast by Malthus that we were going to run out of food.
Yeah.
Malthus said it would be good to go to war and kill off people because it would reduce the population. It was going to be good if women wouldn't get married and wouldn't have children because food was going to become a commodity where the inflation just soared because agriculture had reached a peak.
Yep, yep.
Now, Malthus never saw in the early 1800s the tractor, the combine, the milking machines, and the things that have been added. Our production from the 1850s in the U.S. has grown somewhere close to 600 to 1,000 times what we produced then. Mm-hmm. And the number of people working on the farms and farm work has decreased from 11 million to less than 1 million today. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's productivity.
And the yield is skyrocketed. Yeah, the yield skyrocketed.
And the yield skyrockets. I mean, technology changes our way of life. Technology changes what we do, and it changes the firms.
Right.
You know?
I just think about it, like, think about everything every day that we do, as far as when people who drive cabs, Uber, Lyft, buses, garbage trucks. I mean, it's coming. That's all going to be automated. That's not going to be, and then I don't know when that'll happen. But, you know, is a saying in Silicon Valley, Mike, is that in the first 2 years, we overestimate technology, but within 10 years, we underestimated what it can do?
Yeah. Well, when you think about the history, electricity really enabled us to create larger and more efficient factories because we didn't have to depend upon a central source of steam power. And the telephone and the telegraph.
And the automobile.
And the automobile.
And refrigeration.
Changed businesses and changed what we did. Mm-hmm. And when you think about today, because we have Zoom and Microsoft Teams, a third of working days can be done remotely now. Mm-hmm. A third.
Yep.
You know, that has tremendous impact.
You probably remember the ice truck, don't you?
Uh-huh.
Do you remember the ice truck? No, you don't remember the ice truck. You're not that old.
No, I'm not that old. I even
you
remember,
said 1850, so I figured, all right.
You know, skilled free labor force in the U.S. is earning almost $250 billion. It's become huge. And that has changed the outlook of firms. You know, you spend most of your time working remotely from the office. Mm-hmm. Sarah's in 1 day a week. CJ's in 1 day a week. Mm-hmm. I mean, we can do that. I can remember when I licensed in 1986, there was a Quotron where you got your quotes. Mm-hmm. That wasn't portable. There was no internet. I mean, you were fixed in place.
You had to. You didn't have a choice.
And you had no choice. And you had a landline, only a landline. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you were going to make phone calls, you made them from there. Mm-hmm. I can remember payphones.
I know a payphone.
You had to put in a dime or a quarter to make a phone call from the payphones. All of that changed. The internet changed. The computers have changed. And it's made it possible.
But the way I think of this, though, is in the next, say, 10 to 12 years, we have this inflation we're experiencing right now, but we actually could be looking at long-term deflation, that as there's less young people going into the economy, replacing the workforce, more older people, will the Fed have to really react fast if we start seeing things change here and move interest rates in the other directions, quantitative easing, as some people have predicted?
You know, with interest rates, it's a lot easier to raise and slow an economy than it is to reduce and increase the rate of yield.
But what I'm getting at is over the last 15 years, it's been mostly, actually the last 40 years, right? It's been declining interest rates. You had low interest rate environment. Back to population, but we've seen the decrease in women having children. And so it puts pressure on productivity. And so they have to juice the economy, keep juicing the economy by lowering interest rates. Is that a good policy? Or does that kind of they just kind of let things fall where they may if we see GDP and productivity kind of just trudging along?
I don't know. You know, I think we're in a very different phase than we were 20 years ago. I think if you look at what started during the Obama administration with a focus on creating jobs, that was continued during the Trump administration with a focus on creating jobs, and now on the Biden administration of creating jobs, that's why we have 4 million more jobs than we have workers to fill those jobs. And we're continuing to create more jobs. You know, the Biden administration's pumped in almost $500 billion for job creation. The CHIPS, the IRA, the infrastructure bill, all that to create jobs. And that's not just in the U.S., that's happening worldwide. So we're in a time in which there's a big push to create jobs, and there's more jobs than there are people to fill the jobs. And as you mentioned before, a lot of the jobs are more specialized and more tech. It's not, as we go back to my youth, people used to talk about if you didn't get an education, you'd end up with it as a ditch digger. You know, ditch diggers aren't around anymore. That's a machine that's been mechanized too.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the saying is that you got to constantly keep relearning, right? It's not you go to school and you'll get your degree and you're done from there. You got to constantly keep upgrading your skills because because things change so fast. If you want to stay in the workforce, that's your plan.
Yeah. So we're entering in a different time. All these things are happening, and each one of these are changing the aspect of the firms. They're changing the aspect of companies. They're changing the workplace. They're changing lifestyles. They're changing the demographics. And looking backward and looking at history is not a way to go forward. I mean, I remember having the Palm Pilot and the stylus, and that was really a clever and new technology. You know, today when you look at the Android phone or the Apple phone, we have more computing power in this phone than existed in the world in 1975. I mean, the computing power that we have is phenomenal. I'm old enough to remember buying a calculator that was 1.5 inches or 2 inches thick.
Yep.
And probably 6 inches by 4 inches width and diameter. And all it did was add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And I'm old enough to remember even before that, and we had slide rules.
Yeah. Yep.
And running the slide rule to do calculations. Technology has changed so dramatically. And it's hard to imagine today what we did without a cell phone.
It is. But back to growth, right? Back to finding companies that are going to grow and where they're going to grow and how they're going to grow. You know, as this article I mentioned on China says that China's, one of this is Frederick Newman, he's an economist with HSBC, and he believes China's entering a critical transition phase, no longer able to rely on an abundance of cost-competitive labor force to drive industrialization and growth. Where do they go? I mean, if 280 million of their people are aging and they're not having as many, all their efforts to try to grow their workforce is not working. Can they transition to a consumer-based economy the way they're going and have any growth?
I think one of the questions that has to be asked is, does the top government people really want a consumer-driven economy?
That's the question, right? I mean, can they do it without democratic reforms? Or are they going to stick to their draconian, communist, heavy-handed Mao Zedong type politics?
Let's come back and talk about that right after this commercial break. What will happen in China?
So, Mike, we were just talking about China. I keep bringing up China because right now they're the largest economy, largest population, and pretty much will be the second largest economy in the world. And we talked about their demographics with 280 million elderly people. They're not having enough kids. Their government has gone from, somewhat soft to hardlining, back to the old ways of Mao Zedong. And we thought we were going to get in there, make good friends. They were going to build all our stuff, sell it to us cheaply. We'd go over there and sell them a bunch of stuff and make a bunch of money and get fat and happy. That doesn't look like it's going to happen. I mean, I think that they said by next year that actually India is going to be the most populous country in the world. And I think India could be the big, as I mentioned before, I think India could be the big winner in this war. We end up with China fighting over technology. I don't think we're going to reap the rewards that we think we are from them.
It's going to be interesting to see because the fastest growing economies are those in Indonesia and Vietnam and Thailand. Those economies are growing very fast and they're taking advantage of what's happening in do we call it a war between China and the U.S.?
But how do they politically, how are they going to align themselves when they're going to have to make a choice? And think, where will India align themselves? Right? We don't know. I mean, these are all unknowns.
I know.
And India has as I said, will be the most populous country in the world, they think, in the next couple of years or so. And they have a young population as opposed to China. I forget the numbers, but they have a younger population then. So they get some running room. Let's put it that way.
And they have a lot of U.S. educated.
Very well educated population in comparison. Yes.
They've certainly had their list of problems as well.
Well, the problem with them, and I think we mentioned it in previous shows, you and I discussed it, is what they haven't done is spend their money on the infrastructure like China did. One thing China did really, really well was roads, airports, really fantastic infrastructure, and India doesn't have that.
And that's going to be a drawback. But if you look, China built the factories. They were the factory part of the companies, but India was the back office. Mm-hmm. They did the cold calls. They did the back office portion of the firm.
Do you think we'll see companies saying, let's build factories in India? I mean, are we seeing that? I don't know. I didn't do any sort of looking on that. I got too bogged down in the demographics to look at it. But I mean, will we see more companies try to build in India? They have more of a swing towards being democratic.
And they also have more open policies.
Yeah.
If you look at the world today, with what we're going through and the deglobalization, snowballization, or whatever we want to call it, the reduction of free trade, many countries are offering significant deals for factories to be located in their country.
Right.
India is one of those.
Yeah.
They're offering cheaper labor. They're offering subsidies of all sorts for companies to locate there. So the question is, do you locate in the U.S.? Do you locate in India? Do you locate in Mexico? Do you locate in Canada? I mean, we've gone through the supply chain issues. And we don't want to get back into the supply chain issues we saw with COVID. But the reaction of trying to move everything back to the United States
it's not going to happen.
is not happening either.
No. And what are you going to build? You're not going to build your dollar store widgets in the United States. You can't afford to. Even the dollar stores had to go up to $1.25 now, right? There's $1.25 stores. I mean, you can't build all that stuff back in the United States. It'd be way too expensive. We're looking at what are we building? We want to move the chips. Solar panels, right? Things like that are critical, and that we want to build those things. The high-tech stuff that we know are critical, we want to build here, so we have control.
And yet, while we want to do that, I mean, what's happened in the Netherlands, what's happening with Japan, what's happening with several other countries, is South Korea, they're deciding to subsidize chip factories there. $371 billion of subsidies to build chip factories, $52 billion in the U.S., but $320 billion overseas of people trying to build chip factories other places. So it's not just here. And is it going to become an oversupply problem? I mean, we've gone through the
now we have a short supply. Now, it could be. But I think that more worrisome is where are people going to, like Ray Diallo's last book predicting that China is going to overtake America as the number one in the world reserve currency by, I think, 2050. I don't agree with them, but I think they have I think they have more problems than we have.
And they have too much central control over what goes on.
Right. But what I think is, like we talked about in another previous show, of how they've taken over Europe. They got this stranglehold of all the port, and they're trying to build their Silk Road and all that stuff. Which companies, like Germany was one of their number one, I think their number one trading partner was Germany. Will countries have to make a decision of aligning with the U.S. or aligning with China? And how's that going to affect trade? You can't go through this part of the RC, you can't cross this. How's that going to all play out?
I think one thing that we saw during Russia versus invasion of Ukraine is when the U.S. and other countries sanctioned foreign nationals. One possibility around the issue of China owning the ports is simply for the countries to nationalize. I mean, we saw that with oil. Peru had several families. The Puga family had very significant interest in controlling the oil trade in Peru. Peru decided they needed to help their economy, so they nationalized. I started my career in the aluminum industry. The company was half owned by Peychanet Aluminum and half owned by American Metal Climax. During the recessionary times of the 1990s, late 90s, mid 90s, what did the French government do? They decided to nationalize Peychanet and Credit Lyonnais and Eugene Coleman. And later on, when they ran into other problems, they decided to sell stock to the public, to privatize. So, China has to fear that the fact if they turn off the rest of the world, the countries will simply nationalize those ports.
I didn't think of that. Like the only one that they own, we've talked about, is the Greek port. They own that outright.
Well, and they own Hambantota.
Essentially.
In Sri Lanka.
Can the countries come in and just nationalize? Can just come in and take those ports over?
Not easily.
Yeah.
But in a real conflict, what we're seeing happen in Russia can be done.
Yeah.
You can starve a country. And China has to be really aware of that as well. Anyway, we've just been looking at all those things and the things that are changing in the world. There will be investment opportunities because of what's happening, because of technology, demographics, and lifestyle. It's being in front of the curve rather than behind the curve that will really count. And that's the purpose of this program, is to introduce you, the listener, to what's happening and how it will affect investments. That's where we are. That's what we want to do. That's what we do with our clients. And in the long run, we believe that it really works. And that wraps us up for this week. Have a great weekend, and we will be back next Saturday to talk about money.
You've been listening to About Money with registered investment advisors Mike Adams and Al Souza. If you'd like more information about what you've heard today or about AFC's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you'd like the AFC team to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared in the preceding program was for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. Join us again next Saturday at noon for more About Money with Mike Adams here on AM 1300, The Answer.